بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So, as you know, we've entered now into the first book, the book of the Quran and how to understand statements. We talked a little bit in the last lecture about the Quran and the mutawatir recitations. We're going to pick up right where we left off. And the section of the Quran is actually a very small section of this book. We will finish it probably in the first clip. And then the rest of the clip, we are going to move on to statements and their meaning. So this book, or the book of the Quran and statements and how to understand them, the majority of it is the statements and how to understand them. The Quran is, okay, we define it, we talk about the mutawatir hadith, mutawatir qira'at, and then we'll talk about the difference of opinion of the three extra one from the seven. So some say it's seven, some say it's 10. We'll talk about a little bit why that is the case. Then we will talk about the qira'at al-shadha, we'll talk about the mutawatir qira'at and how we use them and consider them to be like a ahad hadith, singular hadith, and we use them for tafsir purposes. Then we'll talk a little bit about, then we'll segue into meanings. Okay, so we'll begin by talking about statements and their meanings. And this is where probably the material will be a little bit unfamiliar. Certainly it's a challenge in presenting it in English and translation. So hopefully, inshallah, I ask Allah Ta'ala that I did a good job. But we are going to talk about direct meanings and implied meanings and rational meanings. And then we are going to talk about meanings that are congruent with what is said, and then meanings that are implied, and then meanings that are opposite from what is said. And each of those, there will be examples and categories. Now, why is this important to know? Well, it's important to know because this is how we approach understanding the Quran and the Sunnah. So this book, which is quite large, I would go as far as to say almost a fourth or a third of the entire Usul al Fiqh. This is critical to understand, even though it's very technical, because this is how we are going to then understand the verses. So we'll try to do copious examples. One thing that might help you, by the way, is you might want to take a paper or note card and make charts, because sometimes I'm a visual learning myself, sometimes that helps. Anyway, those are the main topics we'll talk about. I'll see you back for the next clip, inshallah. So let me just get my text open and we'll begin the way we have normally begun these classes, which is to, we'll start with a little reading of the text itself, and then we will, translate as we go along. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. وتحرم القراءة بالشاذ والأصح أنه ما وراء العشر وأنه يجري مجرى الآحاد. The dominant position is that aberrant Quranic recitations take the ruling of solitary transmitted statements in the way they are used as proof texts. And then the correct opinion is that these aberrant recitations are what is beyond the known 10, the 7 previously mentioned in addition to the recitation of, and the 3 extra ones are Yaqub, Abi Ja'far, and Khalaf, and I gave you those names before. So it is impermissible to recite the Quran, i.e. from an ibadah point of view, or to recite the Quran from the point, like in prayer, or to say, I'm going to recite the Quran for you now, and then recite with what is beyond the 10. So before we get to the aberrant Quranic readings, the shawad, let's talk about the 7 and then the 10. So for a Quranic recitation to be considered a Quranic recitation, it has to come to us through tawatur, through diffuse congruence, and it has to be mutabiq, it has to be compatible with the rasm of the Mus'haf, the orthography of the Quran, with the Quranic script, the Uthmanic script. So for example, in Surah Al-Fatiha, Maliki Yawmiddin. In the recitation of Hafs, which I just said, Maliki Yawmiddin, there's an alif, Maliki Yawmiddin. But in Warsh, it's Maliki Yawmiddin, without the fatha, without the alif. So in the rasm, in the orthography of the Quran, in the script of the Quran, if you open up Surah Al-Fatiha, you will see that it is Mim, Lam, and between the Mim and Lam, there's like a little dagger for the alif. So it's not written maliki mim alif lam kaf. It's written mim lam kaf, and then there's that little dagger, the hanging dagger, alif, I refer to it as that, the alif. So that script then gives you both recitations. You can either recite the alif maliki yawmiddin or maliki yawmiddin. For example, right? So the script of the Quran, by the way, which is a whole, I find it personally extremely fascinating subject. It's another subject that we're not going to cover at all. But there is rules and regulations to the script. So the first condition is that it has to be mutawatir, and then the second condition is it has to match the script of the Quran. Those are the 7. And then there are 3 lesser ones that have lesser of a level of transmission, but certainly not solitary, which are sahih transitions, and those are the extra 3 of Yaqub, Abi Ja'far, and Khalaf. So Yaqub is Yaqub ibn Ishaq ibn Zayd, he died in 205, and then Abi Ja'far is Yazid ibn al-Qaqa al-Makhzumi, he died in 132, and Khalaf is Khalaf ibn Hisham al-Bazzar, he died in 229. So the usulis tend to stick with the 7 when we consider usul related deductions from the Quran, but the Qurra, the masters of the science of the Quran and the recitation, and then the prayers, the people that lead the prayers and things like that, they will extend it out to those extra 3 to give the total number of 10. So that's the difference between the 7 and the 10. Now there is that which is beyond the 7 and the 10, which they might have chains of transmission that are sound, but they're ahad. They are solitary transmissions. So that's why I refer to them as aberrant Quranic recitations, in the translation in English, to make it clear that you cannot recite the prayers, and you cannot recite in devotional purposes those recitations. Even though they have sound chains of transmission, we do not consider them by consensus part of the Quran. So what are they? We consider them to be solitary transmitted statements, and they are considered to be like tafsir. Like, for example, in the verse about fasting, one solitary recitation would say, فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ مُتَتَابِعَاتٍ. So fast 3 consecutive days. Mutatabi'at is not in the 10 recitations, and it's not in the rasm of the Mus'haf. So therefore, I can't recite that, but we can use that as a tafsir and inform our hukum when we come to codify Islamic law and say, if you fast the 3 days, they have to be consecutive 3 days. So you'll find things like that. And that's another fascinating a fascinating subject of the non-canonical recitations. When you get into the heavy tafsirs, like Al-Razi, for example, or maybe Al-Qurtubi, Al-Tabari, those very elongated tafsirs, they will bring out a lot of these different recitations to show you meanings, right? But again, those are not recitations of the Quran. They're not the Quran. They cannot be considered the Quran according to the thing that we laid out. Okay, and then he says, rahimahullah, وَأَنَّهُ لَا يَجُوزُ الْوُرُودُ مَا لَا مَعْنَى لَهُ فِي الْكِتَابِ وَالسُّنَّةِ وَلَا يُعْنَى بِهِ غَيْرُ ظَاهِرِهِ إِلَّا بِدَلِيلٍ. The dominant opinion is that both the Quran and Sunnah cannot contain words that contain no meaning. Well, obviously, how can the Quran contain things that have no meaning? But believe it or not, there were different sects, like the Hashwiyah, who said that the huruf al-muqatta'a, the words like Taha, Noon, Alif, Lam, Mim, Qaf, Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad, etc. Oh, that's proof that there's nonsense in the Quran. Of course, they mean something. In fact, there's a whole tafsir about what those letters mean. For example, the letters that begin the Quran, there are 14 letters out of the 28 Arabic letters, and if you put them together, they make the following sentence: Nassun Hakimun Qati'un Lahu Sir. A wise statement that is absolute in it is a secret. Every letter in that sentence, Nassun, Noon, Sad, Nassun, Hakimun, Ha, Kaf, Ya, Mim, Nassun, Hakimun, Qati'un Lahu Sir. Those are the 14 letters. I mean, it's not by accident that those 14 letters can make a sentence like that. And then those 14 letters, the ulama say they are the letters of light, al-huruf al-nuraniyya, and then the other 14 letters are the dark letters, al-huruf al-dhulmaniyya. And then subhanallah, there are 18 stations of the moon. So there are 18 stations in which the moon increases. I think it's called waxing, and then 14 stages when the moon decreases, which is waning. So there's a relationship. The idea that this nonsense is not true, even the little things that I just said, that probably will stimulate, like, oh, I had no idea. So the ulama of tafsir, again, you will see that there are many tafsir about what those letters mean. So we say the dominant opinion, just to repeat, is that both the Quran and Sunnah cannot contain words that contain no meaning. Likewise, they cannot contain meanings other than what is deduced from the apparent meaning of words, except with proofs. وَلَا مَا يُعْنَى بِهِ غَيْرُ ظَاهِرِهِ إِلَّا بِدَلِيلٍ. So what we're saying is, the default in interpreting the Quran and Sunnah, the default is going to be the apparent meanings, except if there's a dalil that takes you to a non-apparent meaning, which is why this whole section, we're going to, for class, hours and hours and hours, we're going to be talking about the different permutations of that. So one of the usuli principles, one of our first principles, is we take the prima facie, I'm going to just restate it in my language, we're going to take the prima facie meaning of words, unless there is a reason why and a proof that directs us towards taking, something else. A very simple example are the theological verses referring to body parts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has a hand, or ala al-arsh istawa, Allah manifested on the throne. Obviously, it can't mean that Allah has a hand, two right hands, وَأَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ, or it doesn't mean that Allah ta'ala has a hand like my hand. Why can I take the apparent meaning? Because that is anthropomorphic. That's haram. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Nothing is like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, there is a rational dalil, there is a rational proof, or a rational reason in this case, or theological reason, in which I have to find another interpretation of that verse, because the prima facie tafsir or explanation of that verse would lead to something counterproductive to faith itself. So that's just a simple example. So build on that, all of the other examples that you'll find. So likewise, there cannot contain meanings other than what is deduced from the apparent meanings of words, except without proofs. And indeed, that's a segue into the next section about that. We'll pick up the discussion, inshallah, in the next clip, in which we will conclude this little introductory part about the Quran and then move into statements and their meanings. Okay, so picking up right where we left off, وَأَنَّهُ لَا يَبْقَى مُجْمَلٌ كُلِّفَ بِالْعَمَلِ بِهِ غَيْرَ مُبَيَّنٍ عفوا وَأَنَّهُ لَا يَبْقَى مُجْمَلٌ كُلِّفَ بِالْعَمَلِ بِهِ غَيْرَ مُبَيَّنٍ. Likewise, the dominant opinion is that the Quran and Sunnah cannot contain unclear statements that constitute legal responsibility that were not clarified before the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, from the point of view of taklif, from the point of view of legal responsibility, there can be nothing in the Quran and Sunnah that we have to do that hasn't been clarified. That's another, it's an usuli principle, but if you think about it, it's also like a point of faith. الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينُكُمْ. Today we have completed your religion. It's one of the final verses revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. So one of our points of belief in the Prophet ﷺ is that he completely conveyed the message. Allah Ta'ala says, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We do not punish a people unless and until we send a messenger. So implied in that is that the message itself has got to be fully articulated. There can't be like some hidden thing that only a special select group of people will be able to articulate. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَأَنَّ الْأَدِلَّةَ النَّقْلِيَّةَ قَدْ تُفِيدُ الْيَقِينَ بِانْضِمَامِ غَيْرِهَا. And the dominant opinion is that the transmitted proofs, the Quran and Sunnah, and this is a technical term that you need to know, al-adilla al-naqliya, or al-ulum al-naqliya, or the transmitted sciences, as opposed to al-ulum al-aqliya, as opposed to the rational sciences. So transmitted sciences are like fiqh, hadith, Quran, theology, things like that. The rational sciences, grammar, syntax, morphology, rhetoric, logic, philosophy, mathematics, those are rational sciences. So when we talk about what's your proof, what's your adilla and naqliya, what are the transmitted proofs, that means Quran and Sunnah, because we receive them through transmission. If there's a rational proof, al-adillatul aqliya, this is a different type of situation, or al-adillatul hissiyya, or experiential proofs, that's a different set of proofs. But when we say al-adillatul naqliya, transmitted proofs mean the Quran and Sunnah. So he says, rahimahullah, the dominant opinion is that the transmitted proofs, the Quran and Sunnah, can rise to the level of certainty when placed together. So we might have solitary, like the Quran is all transmitted through tawatur, but let's say that there are, most of the hadith are transmitted through solitary narrations. But when we put all that stuff together, we have a big pile of the hadith, then we have yaqeen. And that's, as simple as it sounds, that's one of the main problems that people have, is that when they're trying to find out what Islam says about something, they don't gather. Gathering all of the proofs is the first task. And the reason people don't do that is, I think, this is me speaking, wallahu a'lam, but I don't think people understand how rich the hadith literature is, and that there are many hadith books and compendiums way beyond the 6 sihah. So you got to make the effort. I mean, now with digital search tools online and whatnot, and different softwares, and maybe now with the use of AI, maybe that will be a little bit easier. But there's a whole host of hadith out there that people just completely forget. And a lot of this, they forget it probably because of the Salafi nonsense of the hadith or da'if, you throw them away. And when we come to the mustalah hadith, we'll talk about all this. But we don't throw anything away. We are an ummah of retention. We retain everything, and we benefit from everything. Okay, this is the end of like the beginning part, the Quran part. Now for the rest of this book / chapter, we're going to talk about al-mantuq wal-mafhum, statements and their meanings. And if I didn't say, we ask Allah Ta'ala to have mercy and blessings on Shaykh al-Islam, Zakaria al-Ansari, and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. قال المنطوق ما دل عليه اللفظ في محل النطق وهو إن أفاد ما لا يحتمل غيره كزيد فالنص أو ما يحتمل بدله مرجوحا كالأسد فظاهر. A statement, okay, some of this will sound like really simple, but it picks up, like it escalates pretty fast. A statement is that whose meaning is taken directly from its words when spoken. If this meaning is singular and cannot be understood otherwise, like saying Zayd, referring to like Ja'a Zayd, Zayd came, a specific person, then we say that this is a text, a nas. So when we use the word a nas, we mean a text that its meaning is what it says. If the statement contains other meanings, which unfortunately are most of the statements, but one meaning is predominant, then the statement is called apparent. So if I say, I came from the masjid and I saw a lion, well, obviously you don't mean the animal, you mean you saw a brave person or a mighty person. So that was an apparent meaning from the usage. If I went to the zoo and I saw a lion, then that would be the first example. When it was a text, that was a straightforward situation. So here we have two terms, a nas, a text, and I conveniently lost my page, and zahir, apparent. So a nas is the word is what it means, and a zahir is there are multiple meanings, but there's an apparent meaning from the usage, right? So the usage is important. يا الله ثم إن دل جزءه على جزء معناه فالمركب وإلا فالمفرد. Words can either be compounded or singular. If words are compounded, then each indicates part of the whole meaning, such as sentences with conjunctions. Otherwise, words are singular. So even our subject, Usul al Fiqh, each word, usul, refers to one thing, fiqh refers to a second thing, and then you put them all together, Usul al Fiqh now means something new. Or pen, pen means this thing, it's singular. Red pen, okay, now there's more than one thing. So one word is describing a feature of it, the color, and the good pen, bad pen, heavy pen, small pen, so on and so forth. I mean, that part I think you guys get. Okay, now we get into the what these words mean. This is where it, like, I think it picks up really. It's like a roller coaster. Like we've been going up, 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 and now whoosh, we're just going to take off. So hold on. ودلالته على معناه مطابق وعلى جزئه تضمن ولازمه الذهني التزام والأوليان لفظيتان والأخيرة عقلية. If the meaning of words are for that which the word was originally established for, so here let us pause. This means that we believe that language is the dominant position in Usul al Fiqh, in the Sunni schools, or that language is established by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. So Allah ta'ala taught Adam the categories, the concepts, etc. And therefore there is an establishment of language. So language can't just forever change, and then door doesn't mean door anymore, and up doesn't mean up anymore. No, there are some things that are immutable because of it's been established by the divine. So if the meanings of the words are for which they had originally been established for, then we say it is a matching meaning, mutabaqa. If the meaning of the words are for part of what the word was established for, then it's a partial meaning, tadammun. Or if the meaning of words are due to some sort of necessary rational correlation, then it is rational meaning, iltizam. So the first two that we just mentioned relate to the word itself, and the last one is partial. Afwan is rational. Okay, so you use the word for, like you use the word lion for the animal that you saw at the zoo. This is a matching meaning. If you use the word lion for the brave person, this is a partial meaning. Or there can be something that is a rational usage that will come up based on the context of, based on the speech. So if you say al-insan, you mean al-hayawan al-natiq, the articulating person. This is what it's matching. Or if you say al-hayawan, an animal, and what you mean by is that the animal can speak or communicate. That's a partial meaning. Or if you said a person and the person was blind, the blindness is an exterior part of the person, so you need the reason for the context of that. I'll pick it up in the next and final clip, inshallah. Okay, and then he says, ثم هي إن توقف صدق المنطوق أو صحته على إضمار فالدلالة وإلا فإن دل على ما لم يقصد فالدلالة إشارة وإلا فدلالة إيماء دلالة إيماء. If statements of rational meaning, so here we're talking about the last of the three categories we just took in the previous clip. If statements of rational meanings to be understood rely on implied meanings, then these meanings are meanings of association. Did I miss something? عفوا. ثم هي إن توقف صدق المنطوق أو صحته على إدمار فالدلالة اقتداء. If the statements of rational meanings, the third category of the three in the previous clip, if they rely on implied meanings, then their meanings are meanings of association, دلالة اقتداء. Meaning, their association can either be a matching meaning, مطابقة, a partial meaning, تضمن, or a rational التزام. And then he says وإلا فإن دل على ما لم يقصد فدلالة إشارة وإلا فدلالة إيماء. If the statements if these statements do not rely on implied meanings and are used for other than apparent meanings, then these are meanings of illusion. Dilalatu ishara. So in the first one that I just mentioned, we are in the rational category. We are talking about statements that rely on an implied meaning. So those are the three subcategories. In this one, if the rational meaning, the iltizam, the third concept of the previous video clip, if they do not reply on implied meanings, and then they are used for apparent meanings, then we say their meanings other than apparent meanings, then we say it's an illusion, it's an ishara. And if the statements are used for their intended meanings, but not relying on something implied, then they are meanings of indication. Dilalatu ima. Dilalatu ima is going to be a subject that we talk about in the chapter of qiyas, of analogy. Now, he moves on and he says, وَالْمَفْهُومُ مَا دَلَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّفْظُ لَا فِي مَحَلِّ النُّطْقِ. If statements are used for their intended meanings, but not reliant on something implied, then their meanings, sorry. وَالْمَفْهُومُ مَا دَلَّ عَلَيْهِ اللَّفْظُ لَا فِي مَحَلِّ النُّطْقِ. Understood meaning, al-mafhum, is the meaning indicated by the words, but not when spoken. فإن وافق المنطوق فالموافقة ولو مساويا في الأصح ثم فحوى الخطاب إن كان أولى ولحنه إن كان مساويا. The understood meaning, mafhum, is the meaning indicated by the words, as I just read, but not when spoken. If the understood meaning matches what is spoken, then the understood meaning matches the spoken words. We call this mafhum al-muwafaqa. Somebody says something and you understand what they say based on what they said. We call this a matched understanding. Even if the understood meaning is equal to or necessarily deduced from the spoken phrase or words in the dominant opinion. ثم فحوى الخطاب إن كان أولى ولحنه إن كان مساويا. If the understood meaning is more than what was said, then فحوى الخطاب. We call it فحوى الخطاب. So ولا تقل لهم أف ولا تنهرهما وصاحبهما في الدنيا معروفا. Allah says, do not tell your parents even uff. So how about hitting, astaghfirullah, hitting your parents? That's more than the spoken word. So that understanding, we call it فحوى الخطاب. Or in the common Arabic, we say ومن باب أولى. It's even more so the case that you shouldn't strike your parents. Because Allah says, don't say uff, which is the most smallest, insignificant, negative thing you can do to your parents. So from min bab awla, it's even more so the case, right? That's fahul khitab, that you don't strike them or don't starve them or punish, something, God forbid that we do it, because these are major sins. And if the understood meaning is equal to the spoken word and what is deduced from the spoken word necessarily, then we call it lah al-khitab. فالدلالة مفهومية على الأصح. What type of understanding and proof do we have from the words that we hear or words that we read? The proof deduced from meanings that match spoken words, the mafhum al-muwafaqa, is based on understanding. So it's not linguistic or rational, but it's based on understanding, mafhum, and not from what is directly understood from the spoken word. And this is a debate amongst obviously the theologians and the other schools. So for us, we say that the type of proof, the dilala, the type of proof that we understand, that we generate from the matching understanding, mafhum al-muwafaqa, we say that it is an understanding. It is mafhumiyya. It is understanding itself. And then he goes on and then he says, وَإِنْ خَالَفَهُ فَالْمُخَالَفَةِ. If meanings are opposite to the spoken words, then these meanings are opposite meanings. Obviously, mafhum al-mukhalafa, the opposite of what is stated. But this has conditions. وَشَرْطُهُ أَنْ لَا يَظْهَرَ لِتَخْصِيصِ الْمَنْطُوقِ بِالذِّكْرِ فَائِدَةٌ غَيْرِ نَفْيِ حُكْمِ غَيْرِهِ. The condition for this type of understanding, which is the opposite meaning, is that it does not restrict anything in the spoken word other than to negate the unspoken ruling in the dominant position. So it has to be specific, the opposite of what was just said. كأن خرج للغالب في الأصح. For example, the spoken word cannot exceed what is generally understood, like in the verse 23 of An-Nisa, وَرَبَائِبُكُمُ الَّتِي فِي حُجُورِكُمْ, since it is generally understood that the raba'ib here, the stepdaughter, belonged to one's wife, one's new wife. So your stepdaughters, that's what's normally understood. So the mafhum al-mukhalafa can't exceed what is normally understood from the verses. أَوْ لِخَوْفِ تُهْمَةٍ. Another condition is that the unspoken cannot be unspoken due to fear or retribution. أَوْ لِمُوَافَقَةِ الْوَاقِعِ. And that the spoken word not be specific to an actual situation. So if there's a text of the Quran or Hadith to a specific situation, you can't say that there's a mafhum mukhalafa, an opposite meaning, because this is limited to the specific thing. أو سؤال, and that the spoken or an answer to a question. So if somebody asked the Prophet ﷺ a question and he answered him, you can't say, oh, there's a mafhum mukhalafa. Well, he just answered a question. أو لحادثة, or to clarify a situation related to a statement. أو لجهل بحكمه أو عكسه. So another condition is that you can't to clarify a situation related to the statement, or that the statement be out of ignorance of the ruling, or ignorance of the ruling not spoken. So for mafhum al-mukhalafa to happen, for the opposite meaning to happen, there are conditions. In other words, the things that he listed, it can't be beyond what is normally understood. It can't be beyond the specificity of the context of the siyaq of what was said. It can't be if the Prophet ﷺ was asked a question and he answered it, there's an opposite meaning in that case. So the opposite meaning is a powerful type of understanding and meaning, but it is limited. It's not open-ended, forever. It has to have these limited type of situations. Okay. Is there anything I wanted else to say? I think that was a lot for today. Like I said, it picks up kind of fast. You might want to watch the lecture a couple more times. I had to prepare by reading it a couple times myself, so it's not something that's straightforward. And I think charts are very helpful. He's going to go on. We're going to talk about the same type of things for the next, from now until the end of the module, basically. But it's important that we understand sentences, structure, what we understand from them. Is the understanding direct, not direct? Is it matching? Is it not matching? Etc. So be patient with it and it will click, inshaAllah. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa alam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. All right, alhamdulillah, in today's lecture we were able to finish the discussion of the Quran and its definition, being the 10 canonical recitations, as I like to translate them. Those are the recitations that we are allowed to recite in the prayer and recite for our devotional works. And then the aberrant Quranic recitations, al-qira'at al-shadha, is what is beyond that, meaning that they are not at that threshold, so they either are not compatible with the script of the Quran, the Uthmanic script, or they are not narrated through tawatur. In that case, we use them for tafsir. We treat them like an ahad hadith, and then we can use them to understand the meanings of the Quran. And then lastly, we said about that the Quran has to contain everything that is clear and understandable, and that there's no nonsense in the Quran. Now, and then from that we move to statements and their meanings. And then we began by talking about apparent words, a text, and apparent meanings. And then we talked about singular words and compounded words. And then we talked about the type of meanings that we can get from the word, either that it matches what it's used for, or there's a partial meaning, or that there's a rational meaning. Underneath the rational meaning, that's where a lot of these subcategories happen. We talk about meanings of association, and then we talked about meanings of illusion, dilalat ishara, and then meanings of indication, dilalatul ima, which is, I said, will come much later when we talked about qiyas. Actually, I don't think in Jam' al-Jawami that's listed here. This is something that Shaykh al-Islam added himself, rahimahullah, because just to make the chart in one's mind full. Then we began to talk about meanings. What do we understand from these type of words? So we talked about if our understanding matches what the words and the statements were used for, then it's mafhum muwafaqa. And then if it is more than what it is used for, it is fahw al-khitab. And if it is equal to what is used for, then it is lahn al-khitab. And then we talked about matched understanding, mafhum muwafaqa, and the opposite meanings, mafhum mukhalafa. But the mafhum al-mukhalafa is more restricted because it has a limited use, because not everything that is spoken there can be an opposite understanding for. These were the major topics. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.